Our little office clerk is home, my dad joked as I walked in. His friend, a Navy SEAL, noticed my tattoo, Unit 77. His smile vanished. Sir, he said to my dad, do you even know who your daughter is? Then he turned to me. Admiral Callahan, ma'am. It's an honor. Video opens with a shot of a strong, determined woman, perhaps in uniform or a professional setting, looking thoughtful, then a subtle shift to a more vulnerable, reflective expression. Have you ever given your entire life, every single ounce of your being, to prove yourself to the one person who should have always seen your worth? And then, in one soul-crushing moment, watch them dismiss you as nothing more than an office clerk to a decorated Navy SEAL? Because that day, for me, changed absolutely everything. I'm Callahan, and for 44 years, I went from being the daughter of a Navy logistics officer to commanding Unit 77, one of the most covert task forces in U.S. Special Operations. For years, I tried to make my father proud. I sent him money, I visited, I let his little jokes about my desk job roll right off my back. But then, that day happened. The day he introduced me to SEAL friend, Jacob Rains, as his little office clerk. Something just snapped. You know what it's like to be utterly underestimated by someone you've spent your whole life trying to impress? If you do, you're not alone. I grew up knowing what duty meant before I even knew how to spell it. My father, Edward Callahan, retired as a lieutenant commander in Navy logistics. He was meticulous, proud, absolutely convinced that real service happened in the field. Boots on the ground, steel on target. Everything else, just support work. I was 8 when he pinned his retirement insignia to a shadow box and told me the military was no place for women who couldn't handle combat. I was 22 when I proved him wrong by joining anyway. He didn't protest when I enlisted. He just signed the paperwork with the same neutral expression he used for requisition forms. I think he assumed I'd wash out, or maybe just settle into some administrative track where I'd be safe and unremarkable. I went to officer candidate school in Rhode Island, graduated near the top of my class, and accepted my commission as an ensign at 23. My father came to the ceremony, but he left early. Said he had a retirement luncheon with his old logistics buddies. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. My early years were spent in intelligence. First, a junior analyst on a destroyer, then joint operations in San Diego. I was good, really good. I connected dots others missed. I anticipated enemy movements through fragments of intercepted comms and satellite imagery. By 26, I was a lieutenant. By 30, a lieutenant commander. I coordinated with SEAL teams, Marine Recon, Air Force Special Operations. I learned their language, their rhythms, their way of thinking about risk. And I also learned they wouldn't take me seriously until I'd proven myself 3 times over. At 33, I was selected to command a joint intelligence fusion cell in Bahrain. A deployment my father dismissed as desk work in the desert. I called him, and he was watching a Padres game. I could hear the announcer in the background. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him my desk work involved coordinating real-time intelligence for strike packages hitting high-value targets across 2 theaters. I didn't mention the nights I stayed awake, tracking assets in hostile territory, or the commendation I received when one of my assessments prevented a massacre. He wouldn't have understood. Or maybe he would have, and that was somehow worse. By 37, I was a commander. 05, equivalent to a lieutenant colonel. I wasn't just analyzing threats anymore, I was shaping operations. I worked directly with special warfare units, in classified spaces where my name didn't appear on any public roster. My father knew I'd been promoted. I sent him a photo. He texted back, "Congrats on the promotion. Your mother would have been proud." My mother, who died when I was 19, told me I could do anything. My father was the one who believed I shouldn't. When I turned 40, I was read into Unit 77. It wasn't a unit you applied for. It was a unit that found you. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was a joint task force specializing in clandestine recovery operations. Hostages, downed pilots, captured intelligence assets. We pulled people out of places no one else could reach. I was appointed executive officer under a 2-star admiral. He told me I had the rare combination of operational intuition and bureaucratic patience. You know how to fight and how to wait, he said. That's what this job takes. 18 months later, he retired. I took command. At 41, I was promoted to captain. 06, This is the rank that separates career officers from those destined for flags. My father didn't attend the ceremony. Doctor's appointment, he said. Couldn't reschedule. Captain Lopez, my second-in-command, stood in as my guest. Afterward, she asked if I was okay. I told her I was. I think I even believed it. I spent the next 2 years running operations across 3 continents. I coordinated with the CIA, the State Department, Foreign Intelligence Services. I made decisions that saved lives and decisions that cost them. I slept 4 hours a night and lived out of a secure facility in Virginia that smelled like recycled air and bad coffee. My father called twice in that span. Once to ask if I could help his neighbor's son get into the Naval Academy. I couldn't. And once to tell me about a reunion he'd attended, where someone's son had just made SEAL Team 6. Now that's a real accomplishment, he said. I told him I had to go. Briefing in 10 minutes. It wasn't a lie. At 43, I was promoted to Rear Admiral, lower half. 07. Pentagon ceremony. Deputy Chief of Naval Operations speech. Leadership. Sacrifice. My father sent flowers. The card read, "Congratulations on your promotion. Still can't believe they let you get this far." I kept that card in my desk drawer for 2 weeks before I threw it away. 6 months later, another promotion. Rear Admiral, upper half. 08. A rank fewer than 1% of officers ever see. I was 44, the youngest woman to hold the position in Naval Special Warfare Command. Unit 77 was still mine, but my role shifted from direct command to strategic oversight. More briefing rooms than operation centers. More managing egos than missions. Necessary work, but not the work my father understood. He still called once a month. The conversations were short, surface level. He'd ask how I was doing. Fine. He'd tell me about his garden or his poker nights. He never asked about my work. I never offered. It became a rhythm, a script we followed because neither of us knew how to break it. I told myself it was enough. I told myself I didn't need his approval. But every time I hung up, I felt the same hollow ache I'd felt at 23, standing in my dress whites while he left early for a luncheon. I sent him money when his pension didn't stretch far enough. I arranged for a contractor to fix his roof. I made sure he had everything he needed, even though he never asked. It was easier than confronting the truth, that I'd spent 2 decades proving myself to a man who would never see me as more than the girl who used to organize his files. I was an admiral. I commanded one of the most elite units in the U.S. military. And to him, I was still just someone who shuffled papers. That was the backdrop. When I came home on leave last spring, I hadn't been back in almost a year. I told myself it was time. I told myself maybe things would be different. I should have known better. The signs were always there. I just chose not to see them. Or maybe I saw them and convinced myself they didn't matter. My father had a way of diminishing things without seeming cruel. He never raised his voice. He never insulted me directly. He just made it clear, in 1,000 small ways, that what I did wasn't real service. It started when I was still a lieutenant. I came home for Thanksgiving, and he introduced me to his poker group as my daughter, the Navy girl. One of them asked what I did, and before I could answer, my father said, "Intelligence analysis. Lots of computers and reports. Not exactly kicking down doors." The men laughed. I smiled and changed the subject. Later, when I tried to tell him about a commendation I'd received, he nodded and said, "That's nice, sweetheart," then went back to watching the game. By the time I made lieutenant commander, the pattern was set. He'd brag about other people's children, sons who were Marines, pilots, SEALs. He'd talk about them with a reverence he never used for me. At a family dinner once, he spent 20 minutes telling a story about his friend's son who'd completed BUD/S training. "Now that's a warrior," he said. "That's someone who's really seen combat." I was sitting right there. I'd just returned from a deployment where I'd coordinated strikes that dismantled an entire terror cell network. I said nothing. I didn't know how to compete with his version of heroism. When I made commander at 37, I called to tell him. He was at a hardware store. I could hear forklifts, intercom announcements. He said, "That's great, Alex. Really great. Hey, I've got to grab some lumber before they close. We'll talk later." We didn't talk later. 3 weeks passed before he called again. And when he didn't mention the promotion. He asked if I knew anyone who could help his buddy's nephew get a job on a base. I gave him a contact number. He thanked me and hung up. The breaking point should have come earlier, but I kept making excuses. He was old-fashioned. He didn't understand modern military structure. He came from a generation that saw women in uniform as anomalies. I rationalized his dismissals as ignorance, not malice. But the truth was simpler and harder. He didn't respect what I did because he didn't see it as real. When I was promoted to captain at 41, I invited him to the ceremony. Details 2 months in advance. Confirmed a week before. He said he'd be there. The morning of, he called. Doctor's appointment. Been on the books for months. Can't reschedule. I asked what it was for. Routine. I didn't push. I told him it was fine. Captain Lopez stood beside me during the pinning. Afterward, she asked if I wanted to get a drink. I said no. I went back to my quarters and stared at the wall for an hour. My father called 2 days later to ask how it went. I gave him a brief summary. He said, "Well, you've always been good at the administrative side of things. That's a valuable skill." I felt something crack inside me. Some small piece of hope I didn't know I was still holding. I thanked him and ended the call. I didn't cry. I'd stopped crying over him years ago. The comments continued. Every visit, every phone call. Always some subtle jab, disguised as humor or observation. "Our little clerk's probably organizing supply chains," he'd say to his friends. Or, "Alex does all the behind-the-scenes stuff. Real important work, even if it's not glamorous." He said it with affection, like he was proud of me for knowing my place. I'd just smile and nod. What else could I do? Tell him I'd been in firefights? That I'd made calls that put lives on the line? That I'd earned my rank through decisions most people couldn't fathom? He wouldn't have believed me. Or worse, he would have, and it still wouldn't have mattered. By the time I made Rear Admiral, lower half, I'd stopped expecting anything from him. The promotion was significant, a flag officer rank, a level of authority most officers never reach. My father sent flowers with a card that felt like a backhanded compliment. I didn't keep it. I didn't need another reminder that his pride was conditional, and his respect was reserved for men who fit his narrow definition of service. When I made Rear Admiral, upper half, 6 months later, I didn't tell him until a week after the ceremony. He sounded surprised when I called. "Another promotion? They're really moving you up fast." I told him it wasn't fast. It was 22 years of work. He said, "Well, you always were good at climbing the ladder. Your mother had that same ambition." It wasn't a compliment. It was a dismissal. I let it go. I always let it go. The last conversation before I came home was brief. I called to let him know I'd be on leave and wanted to visit. He sounded pleased. "That'd be great, Alex. I'm having a few of the guys over for a barbecue. You should come. It'll be good to see you." I asked who'd be there. He rattled off names. Old Navy buddies, a couple of guys from his logistics days, and Jacob Rains, a SEAL commander he'd stayed in touch with. "Jake's a hell of an operator," my father said. "You'll like him. Real warfighter." I said I'd be there. I hung up and stared at my phone, wondering why I kept doing this to myself. I drove 6 hours to my father's house. The route was familiar. Interstate 95 through Virginia, cutting west toward the Blue Ridge foothills where he'd retired 15 years ago. The house was small, a single-story ranch with a carport and a yard that desperately needed mowing. I arrived just after 1,300 hours on a Saturday. The driveway was already crowded with trucks and a Jeep with veteran plates. I parked on the street and sat in my car for a moment, gathering myself. I was in dress whites. I'd come straight from a ceremony in D.C. and hadn't had time to change. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a barbecue. My father was in the backyard when I walked around the side of the house. He was standing near a grill, beer in hand, talking to 3 men I didn't recognize. One of them was younger, maybe late 30s, with the build and bearing of someone who still ran 10 miles before breakfast. That had to be Rains. My father saw me first. He grinned and raised his beer. "Our little office clerk is home," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. The men turned. A couple of them chuckled. I forced a smile and kept walking. My father met me halfway across the yard and pulled me into a one-armed hug. "Look at you, all dressed up. You come from a meeting or something?" I told him I'd been at a change of command ceremony in D.C. He nodded absently, already turning back to his friends. "Guys, this is my daughter, Alex. She's in the Navy. Does all the intel paperwork and coordination. Real brain work." One of the older men shook my hand. "Logistics?" he asked. I said, "Intelligence and special operations." He nodded like he didn't know the difference. The younger man, Rains, stepped forward. He had sharp eyes and the kind of calm intensity you see in operators who've spent years in bad places. He extended his hand, and I shook it. "Commander Rains," he said. "Good to meet you, ma'am." "Likewise," I said. My father clapped him on the shoulder. "Jake here just got back from a rotation overseas. Can't talk about it, but let's just say he's been keeping the bad guys on their toes." Rains smiled politely, but said nothing. I liked him immediately. We moved toward the grill. My father handed me a beer, and the conversation shifted to sports, the weather. The usual safe topics men default to when they're not sure what to say. I stood at the edge of the group, half listening, trying to decide how long I needed to stay before I could make an excuse and leave. That's when Rains saw the tattoo. It was on my left forearm, just below the sleeve of my dress whites. A trident, with the number 77 beneath it. Small. Precise. I'd gotten it years ago, back when Unit 77 was still new, and we were still figuring out what we were. Stupid decision in hindsight. Officers aren't supposed to get unit tattoos. But I was younger then, and it felt important. I'd kept it covered ever since, but dress whites have short sleeves. There was no hiding it. Rains was mid-sentence when he saw it. He stopped talking. His expression shifted from casual to something else. Recognition. Maybe disbelief. He stared at my arm for a long moment, then looked up at my face, then back at the tattoo. "Unit 77, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "That's right." The yard went quiet. My father looked between us, confused. "What's Unit 77? Rains didn't answer. He was still staring at me, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He was putting pieces together, my rank, my age, the tattoo, the fact that I'd just come from a ceremony in D.C. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, almost hesitant. "Sir," he said, turning to my father. "Do you know who your daughter is?" My father blinked. "What do you mean?" "She's Alex. She works in intelligence." Rains shook his head slowly. He turned back to me, and I saw the exact moment he made the connection. His posture shifted. He straightened, his hands dropping to his sides, and when he spoke again, it was with the formal tone of someone addressing a superior officer. "Admiral Callahan." "Ma'am, it's an honor." The silence that followed was absolute. My father's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The other men stared, processing what they'd just heard. One of them, an older guy in a faded Marine Corps t-shirt, looked at me, then at my father, then at Rains. "Admiral," he said. "She's an admiral?" Rains nodded. "Rear Admiral, upper half, sir. She commands Unit 77. It's a joint task force for clandestine recovery operations, hostage rescue, asset extraction, high-risk intelligence missions. If you've heard about it, you shouldn't have." He looked at me again, and there was something close to awe in his expression. "Ma'am, I worked with your people in Syria 2 years ago. You pulled out 6 of ours when everyone else said it was impossible. I didn't know you were." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I'm sorry. I had no idea. I didn't know what to say." I looked at my father. He was pale, his beer forgotten in his hand. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You're an admiral?" he finally managed. I nodded. "Since last year." He blinked. "But you said you worked in intelligence." "I do," I said. "I also command a special operations task force. I have for the last 3 years." He stared at me like I was speaking a language he didn't understand. Rains stepped back, giving us space, but I could feel his eyes on me. The other men had gone quiet, uncomfortable witnesses to something they hadn't signed up for. My father set his beer down on a nearby table. His hands were shaking slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I just looked at him. This man who'd spent 2 decades dismissing everything I'd done. I tried. The barbecue didn't recover. Rains and the other men made awkward excuses within the hour. They shook my hand with a deference I wasn't used to outside of official settings, offered stiff "thank yous for your service," and left. Rains lingered the longest. He pulled me aside near my car and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." I cut him off. "You didn't do anything wrong, Commander. If anything, I should thank you." He nodded, but he still looked uncomfortable. "Your father's a good man," he said. "He talks about you all the time. He's proud of you." I didn't correct him. There was no point. When everyone was gone, I went back inside. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure whether to sit or leave. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I didn't recognize in his expression. Not anger. Not dismissal. Shame. I didn't know, he said quietly. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. You didn't ask. He flinched. A small movement, barely perceptible, but I saw it. I thought. He stopped, shaking his head. I thought you were doing admin work. Coordination. He gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. Intended, but I didn't. Take them back. Every time I tried to tell you what I did, you changed the subject. Every time I came home, you introduced me as your clerk. You dismissed every promotion, every deployment, every piece of my career like it didn't matter. So, no, Dad, you didn't say it. But you made it very clear. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. I didn't mean to. He stopped again, struggling. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I didn't make a big deal out of it, you wouldn't get hurt when things didn't work out. I stared at him. Things did work out. I'm an admiral. I've done things most people will never even hear about. And you weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself. He didn't argue. He just sat there. This man who'd spent his whole life believing he understood how the world worked, realizing maybe he didn't. I thought about leaving, about walking out and never coming back. But there was something in his face, some small crack in the armor he'd worn for so long, that made me stay. Why didn't you come to my ceremonies? I asked. Why didn't you ever ask what I actually did? He rubbed his face with both hands. I don't know, he said. I guess I was scared. Of what? Of realizing I was wrong about you. The admission hung in the air between us. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to absolve him, to say it was okay, that we could move past it. But it wasn't okay. 20 years of dismissal couldn't be erased with a single moment of honesty. I need to go, I said, standing. He looked up, panicked. Alex, wait. I'm not leaving forever, I said. I just need some air. I walked out to the porch and sat on the steps. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the yard. I thought about every time he'd introduced me as his clerk, every time he'd bragged about someone else's son, every time he'd made me feel like I was less than. And I thought about Rains, the way his expression had shifted when he saw the tattoo, the way he'd straightened and called me ma'am. It was the first time my father had ever seen someone treat me with the respect I'd earned. He came out 10 minutes later and sat beside me. We didn't speak for a while. Finally, he said, I'm sorry. I didn't look at him. For what, specifically? For not seeing you, he said. For not understanding what you were doing. For making you feel like it didn't matter. I nodded slowly. Okay. That's it, he asked. Just okay. I turned to face him. What do you want me to say? That it's fine. That I forgive you? I don't know if I do yet. You spent 2 decades treating me like I was playing pretend. Do you have any idea what that felt like? He shook his head. No, I don't. Then give me time, I said. Give me time to figure out if I can get past this. He nodded. We sat in silence for a while longer. Then he said, Unit 77. That's really what you command? Yes. And you've been doing this for how long? 3 years in command, but I've been working in special operations for over a decade. He let out a long breath. Jesus, Alex, I had no idea. I know, I said. And that was the problem. I didn't see my father for 3 months after that. We spoke on the phone twice, short, stilted conversations where neither of us knew quite what to say. He asked how I was doing. Fine. He asked if I was safe. I told him as much as I could, which wasn't much. He didn't press. It was progress, I suppose. But it didn't feel like enough. Word spread quickly through the veteran community in his town. My father told me later that within a week, everyone knew. The man who'd spent years dismissing his daughter's career suddenly found himself fielding questions about what it was like to raise a flag officer. He handled it poorly at first. He tried to deflect, to downplay, to pretend he'd always known. But the men he'd served with weren't stupid. They could read between the lines. One of them, a retired Marine colonel, apparently cornered him at a VFW meeting and said, Ed, you've been telling us for years your daughter pushes papers. Meanwhile, she's out there running missions most of us couldn't even dream of. What the hell were you thinking? My father didn't have an answer. He called me that night, and for the first time in my life, he sounded small. They all know, he said. Everyone's talking about it. I was in my office at the time, reviewing mission briefs for an operation in the Horn of Africa. I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair. And I feel like an idiot. You should, I said. It wasn't kind, but it was true. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I started reading about Unit 77. There's not much out there, but I found some articles, some old news reports about missions that weren't attributed to anyone. Was that you? Some of it, I said. Most of it, you'll never read about. Why not? Because that's how it works, Dad. We don't exist on paper. We do the jobs no one else can do, and then we disappear. That's the point. He let out a long breath. I had no idea. I thought. He stopped. I don't know what I thought. I felt something shift in me then. A small loosening of the anger I'd been carrying. He was trying. It was clumsy and inadequate, but he was trying. Dad, I said, I need you to understand something. I didn't do this for recognition. I didn't do it to prove you wrong. I did it because it mattered. Because people's lives depended on someone making hard calls, and I was willing to make them. But it would have been nice to know that you saw that. That you respected it. I do now, he said. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I do. Okay, I said. That's a start. We talked for another 20 minutes. He asked questions, careful, tentative questions, about my work, my rank, what it meant to command a unit like 77. I answered what I could. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was the first real conversation we'd had in years. Over the next few months, something changed. He started calling more often, and the calls felt different. He wasn't trying to impress me with stories about other people's accomplishments. He wasn't dismissing what I did. He asked about my day, my deployments, the people I worked with. He still didn't understand most of it, but he was trying to. That mattered. He also started going to therapy. He didn't tell me at first. I found out through a mutual friend who ran into him at the VA. When I asked him about it, he was embarrassed. I figured I should talk to someone, he said. About what? About why I treated you the way I did. About why I couldn't see what was right in front of me. I didn't know what to say. I settled on. That's good, Dad. I'm glad. I saw the change in other ways, too. He stopped bragging about other people's kids. He stopped introducing me as his clerk. When someone asked what I did, he'd say, she's a rear admiral in the Navy, commands a special operations unit. I can't tell you much more than that, but I'm proud of her. The first time I heard him say that, I almost cried. But pride wasn't the same as understanding, and respect wasn't the same as repair. There were still moments when I'd catch him looking at me like he didn't recognize me, like the daughter he thought he knew had been replaced by someone else entirely. Maybe that was true. Maybe I had changed so much that the girl he remembered didn't exist anymore. Or maybe she never did. I threw myself into work. It was easier than dealing with the mess at home. I had operations to plan, people to protect, missions to execute. Unit 77 ran 3 major operations in those months, all successful. We pulled a kidnapped journalist out of Yemen, extracted a compromised intelligence asset from Eastern Europe, and recovered sensitive materials from a downed reconnaissance drone in the South China Sea. Each one required precision, coordination, and a level of risk management that kept me awake at night. But they worked. My people came home. That was all that mattered. Captain Lopez noticed I was different. We were reviewing after-action reports one evening when she said, "You okay, ma'am? You seem distracted." I told her I was fine. She didn't believe me. "If you need to talk." "I don't," I said. Then, softer. "But thank you." She nodded and went back to the reports, but I could feel her watching me. Lopez was good at reading people. It was one of the reasons I'd chosen her as my second. She knew when to push and when to let things go. She let this go. That night, alone in my quarters, I thought about my father. About the way he looked at me on that porch. The shame in his eyes, the apology he didn't know how to give. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to earn his respect. The ways I'd bent myself into shapes I thought he'd approve of. And I thought about the fact that I'd made it to admiral without him ever understanding what that meant. Maybe he understood now. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I'd done it. And that had to be enough. The invitation came in late autumn. A formal request from Naval Special Warfare Command for me to attend a change of command ceremony in San Diego. I was handing over Unit 77 to my successor, Captain Elena Park, a brilliant officer I'd mentored for the past 2 years. It was time. I'd been in command for 3 years, and the toll was starting to show. I needed a new challenge, a new mission. I'd been offered a position as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information Warfare. It was a significant move, a desk at the Pentagon, a voice in strategic decisions that would shape the Navy for the next decade. I accepted. I called my father to tell him about the ceremony. I didn't expect him to come. San Diego was a long trip, and his health had been declining. But when I asked, he didn't hesitate. "I'll be there," he said. "I wouldn't miss it." I told him he didn't have to. He said, "I know, but I want to." The ceremony was scheduled for early December, a crisp Saturday morning at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The sky was clear, the ocean visible in the distance. The kind of perfect California day that feels stolen from a postcard. I arrived early, dressed in service dress blues, my uniform crisp, ribbons aligned. The ceremony would be formal. Dignitaries, senior officers, a speech or two. I'd done this before, but never from this side. Never as the one letting go. My father arrived an hour before. I saw him from across the parade ground, walking slowly with a cane I didn't know he needed. He was wearing his old service dress uniform, the one he'd kept in a garment bag for 15 years. It fit him differently now, looser in some places, tighter in others. He looked older, smaller, but he stood straight. When he reached me, he saluted. I returned it, then pulled him into a hug. "You didn't have to wear the uniform," I said. "I wanted to," he replied. Felt right. We didn't have much time to talk before the ceremony began. I introduced him to a few of my staff, including Captain Lopez and Lieutenant Park. He shook their hands with a formality I wasn't used to seeing from him. When Lopez said, "Your daughter's the best commander I've ever served under," he nodded and said, "I'm starting to understand that." The ceremony itself was precise and efficient, the way military ceremonies always are. There were speeches, one from the outgoing two-star, one from me, one from Park. I talked about service, about the mission, about the extraordinary people I'd had the honor of leading. I didn't talk about my father. But when I looked out at the crowd and saw him standing in the front row, tears streaming down his face, I felt something break open inside me. After the ceremony, after the handshakes and the photos and the obligatory small talk, my father and I found a quiet spot near the waterfront. We sat on a bench overlooking the bay, the sound of seagulls and distant boat engines filling the silence between us. He was the first to speak. I should have known, Lex. It was the first time he'd called me that in years. My mother used to call me Lex. He'd stopped after she died. Known what? I asked. Who you were. What you were capable of. I should have seen it. I looked out at the water. Maybe. But you didn't. I was scared, he said. Of you. Of losing you. Of you going somewhere I couldn't follow. I turned. To face him. I've been going places you couldn't follow for 20 years, Dad. That's the job. He nodded. I know. And I made it worse by pretending I didn't see it. By acting like what you did didn't matter. I thought if I didn't take it seriously, it wouldn't be real. And if it wasn't real, you'd be safe. But I wasn't safe, I said. I was in danger. I've been in danger my entire career. And you never acknowledged it because you couldn't handle it. You're right, he said. And I'm sorry. We sat in silence for a while. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. He handed it to me without a word. Inside was his Navy ring, the one he'd worn for 30 years. What's this? I asked. It's yours, he said. I should have given it to you a long time ago. Dad, I can't. Yes, you can, he interrupted. You earned it. You earned it more than I ever did. I held the ring in my hand, feeling its weight. It was scratched and worn, the gold dulled from decades of wear. It smelled faintly of metal and salt air. I slipped it onto my finger. It was too big, but I didn't care. Thank you, I said. He nodded. And for a moment, I thought we might actually be okay. Not healed, not whole, but something close to understanding. I just never thought they'd let someone like us lead a unit like that, he said quietly. I pulled the ring off and handed it back to him. He looked confused. What? They didn't let me, Dad, I said. I earned it. There's a difference. His face fell. He stared at the ring in his palm, then back at me. I didn't mean, I know what you meant, I said. And that's the problem. You still don't get it. This wasn't about luck or being let in. This was about proving myself every single day for 20 years. It was about being twice as good to get half the credit. It was about making decisions that would have broken most people and doing it without recognition because that's what the job required. He looked down. I'm sorry, Alex. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be what you need. I needed a father who believed in me, I said. But I'll settle for one who's trying to understand. It was quiet for a long time. Then he closed his hand around the ring and said, I'm trying. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I am. I know, I said. We sat there until the sun began to set, painting the bay in shades of orange and pink. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. A crack in the wall. A possibility. When we finally stood to leave, he offered me his arm. I took it, and we walked back toward the parking lot together. An old man in an outdated uniform and his daughter, the admiral. Neither of us quite sure what came next, but willing to find out. The months that followed were a study in reconstruction. I threw myself into my new role at the Pentagon, learning the rhythms of bureaucratic warfare, navigating the politics of joint operations planning and information warfare strategy. It was different from commanding Unit 77, less immediate, more abstract, but no less important. The decisions I made would ripple through the entire Navy, shape doctrine and capability for years to come. My father and I spoke every week. The conversations were still sometimes awkward, still sometimes strained, but they were real. He asked questions about my work, and I answered as much as I could. He told me about his therapy sessions, about the things he was learning about himself. The therapist says I have trouble accepting things I can't control, he said once. She says I try to make you smaller, so I wouldn't have to worry about you. That sounds about right, I said. He laughed. A short, bitter sound. Yeah, it does. He started reading military history, books about leadership, about women in combat, about the evolution of special operations. He'd call me with questions about things he didn't understand. It says here that Admiral Grace Hopper invented computer programming languages, he said once. Did you know that? I told him I did. She was a rear admiral, he continued. Just like you. I never knew that. There have been a lot of women doing remarkable things in the military, I said. We've just been doing it quietly. Too quietly. He said, someone should have told me. I wanted to say that I'd tried to tell him, that I'd spent years trying to make him see. But I let it go. He was learning. That had to be enough. In the spring, he came to visit me in Virginia. It was the first time he'd ever come to see me rather than the other way around. I picked him up from the airport, and we drove through Arlington, past the Pentagon, past the memorials and monuments that marked the capital of American military power. He stared out the window like a tourist, taking it all in. You work here, he said, more to himself than to me. You actually work here? I do, I said. What's it like? I thought about it. Overwhelming, frustrating, rewarding, all of it at once. I showed him my office, a small space with a window overlooking the river, walls lined with commendations and photos from various commands. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking. This is real, he said quietly. This is actually real. It always was, I said. He nodded. I know. I'm starting to understand that. We had dinner that night at a quiet restaurant in Alexandria. Over wine and pasta, he told me about his life, about the things he regretted, about the ways he wished he'd been different. I was a good logistics officer, he said, but I was a mediocre father. I see that now. You weren't mediocre, I said. You were absent. There's a difference. He flinched, but he didn't argue. You're right. I was. And I'm sorry. I took a sip of wine, considering my next words carefully. I used to think that if I just did enough, achieved enough, you'd finally see me. But the problem wasn't what I did. The problem was that you'd already decided who I was. And nothing I accomplished could change that. Until Rains, he said. I nodded. Until Rains. I hate that it took someone else telling me for me to believe it, he said. I hate that I couldn't see it on my own. So do I said. But here we are. We finished dinner in relative silence. Afterward, we walked along the Potomac, the city lights reflecting off the dark water. He moved slowly, leaning on his cane, but he insisted on walking. I need to ask you something, he said after a while. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? I didn't answer right away. I thought about all the years of dismissal, all the times he'd made me feel invisible. I thought about the girl I'd been, desperate for his approval, and the woman I'd become, who'd learned to live without it. I don't know, I said finally. Maybe. But forgiveness isn't going to erase what happened. It's not going to give me back the years I spent trying to be enough for you. I know, he said. I just needed to hear you say it. We walked in silence for a while longer. Then he said, for what it's worth, you were always enough. I was just too stupid to see it. It wasn't absolution, but it was honest. And honesty, I was learning, was its own form of repair. My father's health declined over the next year. It started with small things, shortness of breath, fatigue, a persistent cough. He kept dismissing his allergies. By summer, the doctors had a diagnosis. Congestive heart failure, complicated by decades of untreated hypertension. They gave him 2 years, Maybe 3 if he was lucky and followed their orders. He wasn't good at following orders. I flew home as often as I could, juggling Pentagon briefings with hospital visits, secure phone calls with bedside conversations. He hated that I was there, hated that I was seeing him weak. "You've got more important things to do than babysit an old man," he'd say. I'd tell him there was nothing more important, and he'd shake his head like he didn't believe me. But he'd also talk more openly than he ever had before. About my mother. About his own father. About the ways generational trauma gets passed down like heirlooms no one wants, but everyone keeps. "My dad never told me he was proud of me either," he said once. "I swore I'd be different with my kids, and then I just repeated the same mistakes." "You didn't have to," I said. "I know," he replied. "But it's easier to repeat what you know than to build something new." He looked at me, his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "You built something new. You broke the pattern." "I had to," I said. "There wasn't another option." He smiled weakly. "You always were stubborn. You got that from your mother." In the fall, I brought Lieutenant Park to meet him. She'd taken command of Unit 77 with the same precision and dedication I'd hoped for. And I wanted him to see what came next, to understand that the work continued. He sat in his living room, oxygen cannula in his nose, and listened as Park told him about a recent operation. Classified details stripped away, but the shape of it clear enough. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "You're doing good work," he said. "Thank you, sir," Park replied. He turned to me. "You trained her." "I mentored her," I corrected gently. "She did the work herself." He looked between us, and I saw something like wonder in his face. "This is your legacy," he said. "Not just the missions. The people." I hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. The missions would be forgotten, buried in classified archives no one would ever read. But the people, the officers I'd trained, the leaders I'd shaped, they'd carry forward. They were the legacy. By December, he was in hospice. I took emergency leave and moved into his house, sleeping on the couch, managing his care, fielding calls from distant relatives who suddenly wanted to reconnect. Captain Lopez handled my responsibilities at the Pentagon without complaint. "Take the time you need, ma'am," she said. "We've got this." My father drifted in and out of consciousness those final weeks. Sometimes he'd wake and know exactly where he was, who I was. Other times, he'd call me by my mother's name, or ask when he had to report for duty. I'd hold his hand and tell him he was home, that he was safe, that everything was taken care of. 3 days before he died, he had a moment of clarity. He called me over to his bed, his voice barely a whisper. "Lex, I'm here, Dad. I need to tell you something." "Okay." I was wrong about everything. About you. About what mattered. About what makes someone a warrior. You were braver than any of us. You walked into rooms where no one wanted you and made them give you a seat at the table. That's courage. That's real strength. I felt tears burning in my eyes. "Thank you for saying that." "I should have said it 20 years ago," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't." "I know," I said. "I forgive you." He closed his eyes, and I thought he drifted off again. But then he squeezed my hand and said, "Your mother would be so proud of you." "I am too. I hope you know that." "I do know," I said. He died 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning, just after dawn. I was sitting beside him, reading a book, when his breathing changed. I set the book down and took his hand, and I stayed there until the end. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was nothing like the way he lived. And maybe that was a mercy. We buried him with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. It took some work. He hadn't served long enough to automatically qualify, and his rank wasn't high enough to guarantee a spot, but I made some calls, pulled some strings, and got him in. He would have hated that I used my position to arrange it. He also would have been secretly pleased. The funeral was small, a handful of his old Navy friends, some neighbors, a few distant relatives. Captain Lopez came, and Lieutenant Park, and Commander Rains, who'd stayed in touch after that barbecue. The Navy provided an honor guard, young sailors in dress blues, who folded the flag with mechanical precision and handed it to me with rehearsed words of gratitude for his service. I held the flag in my lap during the chaplain's remarks, feeling its weight, thinking about what it represented. Not just my father's service, but mine. Not just his legacy, but the one I was still building. When the honor guard fired the rifle salute, I didn't flinch. I'd heard worse sounds in worse places. After the service, people approached me to offer condolences. They told me he was a good man, a dedicated officer, a loyal friend. They told me he'd talked about me constantly in his final year, that he'd been so proud. I thanked them and smiled and played the part of the grieving daughter. And I was grieving, but not just for the man who died. I was grieving for the relationship we never had, for the years we'd wasted, for the understanding that came too late. Rains was the last to approach. He stood at attention and said, "Admiral, I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Commander." He hesitated, then said, "If it helps." He changed. After that day at the barbecue, he really changed. He spent the last year trying to understand who you were. "That's worth something." "It is," I said, "but it doesn't erase the 20 years before it." "No," Rains agreed, "but it counts for something." I nodded. He saluted, and I returned it. And then he walked away, leaving me alone with the flag and the silence. I returned to work a week after the funeral. There was a backlog of decisions waiting, briefings to attend, meetings to chair. I dove in with the focus that had defined my career, channeling grief into productivity the way I always had. Captain Lopez noticed, of course. "Ma'am, if you need more time." "I don't," I said. "Work is what I need right now." She didn't push, but she watched me carefully, the way a good executive officer does. And maybe she was right to worry. I was working 14-hour days, sleeping 5 hours a night, avoiding anything that required me to sit still and feel. It was unsustainable, and I knew it. But sustainable wasn't the point. Surviving was. 2 weeks after the funeral, a package arrived at my office. No return address, just my name and rank in my father's handwriting. Inside was his Navy ring, the one he tried to give me at the change of command ceremony. And beneath it, a note on yellowed paper, the ink slightly smudged. "Lex, asterisk if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't give this to you in person, but you gave it back last time, and I understood why. I didn't earn the right to pass it to you, but I want you to have it anyway. Not because of what I did, but because of what you've done. You didn't just meet the standard. You became the standard. I wish I'd told you that more. I wish I'd seen it sooner. But I see it now. You're not my little clerk. You never were. You're Admiral Alexandra Callahan, and you're everything I should have been. Carry this if you want. Leave it in a drawer if you don't. Either way, know that I finally understood who you were." And I was in awe. Asterisk Dad, I read the note 3 times. Then I slipped the ring onto my finger. It was still too big, but I didn't care. I wore it for the rest of the day, feeling its weight, its history, the complicated legacy it represented. When Captain Lopez noticed, she didn't say anything. She just nodded. A small gesture of understanding. That night, alone in my quarters, I thought about my father. About the man he'd been, and the man he'd tried to become. About the ways we'd hurt each other, and the small grace of his final year. He'd spent 2 decades dismissing me, and 1 year trying to make up for it. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. I thought about my mother, too. The woman who'd believed in me from the beginning, who told me I could do anything. I wish she'd lived to see what I'd become. I wish she'd been there for the promotions, the ceremonies, the moments that mattered. But maybe she had been. In some way I couldn't measure or prove. And I thought about the younger officers I'd mentored, Park, and the dozens of others who'd passed through my commands over the years. Women who'd faced the same quiet dismissals, the same subtle undermining, the same impossible standards. I tried to give them what I never had. Someone who saw them, who believed in them, who cleared the path so they didn't have to fight every battle I'd fought. That was the real work, not the operations or the missions or the classified briefings. The real work was making sure the next generation didn't have to prove themselves the way I had. The real work was changing the culture. One conversation, one decision, one promotion at a time. I pulled out my phone and called Lieutenant Park. She answered on the second ring. "Admiral, is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I just wanted to check in. How's command treating you?" "It's good, ma'am. Challenging, but good." "That's how it should be," I said. "Elena, I need you to remember something." "Yes, ma'am. You belong there. You earned that command through years of hard work and dedication. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Not your peers, not your superiors, not anyone." There was a pause, then quietly. "Did someone make you doubt it, ma'am?" "For a long time," I said. "Too long. Don't make my mistake." "I won't," she said. "I promise." "Good. Carry on, Lieutenant." "Aye, ma'am." I hung up and sat in the silence of my quarters, feeling something like peace settle over me. My father had introduced me wrong once. He'd called me his little clerk, dismissed my achievements, refused to see who I'd become. But in the end, he'd seen it. In the end, he'd known. And maybe that was enough. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but acknowledgement. The recognition that I'd done something worthy, something that mattered. I'd served quietly for 20 years, and then someone had finally noticed. Not because I demanded it, but because the truth had a way of revealing itself. I looked down at my father's ring, still too big on my finger, and thought about the note he'd left. "You're everything I should have been," he'd written. But he was wrong about that. I wasn't what he should have been. I was what I'd chosen to become. And that distinction mattered. 5 years later, I stood in the same Pentagon office, now as a 3-star admiral, serving as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. The responsibilities had grown. The decisions had become weightier. But the core of the work remained the same: protecting people, enabling missions, shaping the future of naval warfare. I was 50 now, with more gray in my hair and more lines around my eyes. But I was still here, still serving. Still fighting for the things that mattered. Lieutenant Park was now Commander Park, commanding her own battle group. She'd exceeded every expectation I'd had for her, and I'd had high expectations. We spoke regularly, and every conversation reminded me why I'd chosen this path. Not for recognition or glory, but for the opportunity to build something that would outlast me. My father's ring sat in a small wooden box on my desk, next to his final note. I didn't wear it anymore. It was too loose and too impractical for the work I did. But I kept it close. Some days I'd open the box and read the note, reminding myself of how far we'd both come. Other days, I'd leave it closed, focused on the present rather than the past. The wound he'd left hadn't fully healed. I'm not sure it ever would. But it had scarred over, leaving behind a harder, wiser version of myself. I'd learned that respect couldn't be demanded, only revealed. That some apologies came through changed behavior rather than words. That legacy wasn't about the recognition you received, but about the people you lifted up. On quiet evenings, when the Pentagon emptied out and I had the office to myself, I'd think about that barbecue. About my father's joke, "Our little office clerk is home." And Commander Rain's response. About the look on my father's face when he realized he'd been wrong. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it had felt like grief. But grief wasn't the end of the story. The end was what came after. The slow rebuilding, the tentative reconciliation, the grace of his final year. He'd spent 2 decades getting it wrong, and 1 year trying to make it right. It hadn't erased the hurt, but it had transformed it into something bearable, something I could carry. I kept his Navy ring as a reminder. Not of him, but of the choice I'd made. The choice to serve anyway, to excel anyway, to build a career worth having, even when no one was watching. I'd done it for myself, not for him. But in the end, he'd seen it. And that had mattered more than I'd expected. Now, standing at my office window overlooking the Potomac, I thought about what I'd tell my younger self if I could. I'd tell her that validation would come eventually, but not in the way she expected. I'd tell her that she'd spend years proving herself to someone who couldn't see her, and that it would hurt, but it wouldn't break her. I'd tell her that she'd make admiral, that she'd command elite units, that she'd shape the future of naval warfare. And I'd tell her that none of it would mean as much as the moment when her father finally called her by her rank. He'd introduced me wrong once, but in the end, he knew exactly who I was. And maybe after everything, that was enough. 1 year later, I was sitting in a congressional hearing room, testifying about the future of special operations integration. The questions were pointed, the atmosphere tense. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, my father would have been terrified by this. Not because of the stakes, he'd understood pressure, but because he never would have imagined his daughter in this chair, speaking with authority about national security strategy to people who held the nation's purse strings. The hearing wrapped at 1,600 hours. I had 30 minutes before my next meeting. So, I ducked into a quiet corridor and checked my phone. There was a message from Commander Park. "Ma'am, something you should see." Below it was a link to a military blog post titled "The Invisible Admirals: Women Who Shaped Modern Naval Warfare." I clicked it. My name was there, alongside a dozen others. The article was well-researched, citing operations that had been recently declassified, missions I'd almost forgotten about. It mentioned Unit 77 by name. Apparently, some of our work had finally been cleared for public discussion. The comment section was predictably mixed. Half the responses were supportive. The other half questioned whether women belonged in combat leadership at all. I closed the browser. Some battles never ended. They just changed shape. That evening, I drove out to Arlington. I hadn't been back since the funeral, and I wasn't sure why I was going now. Maybe because the hearing had drained me. Maybe because seeing my name in print alongside special operations and classified missions made me think about how long it had taken for anyone to notice. Maybe because I was tired of carrying the weight alone. The cemetery was nearly empty at this hour. I found my father's grave easily. Section 60, row C. A simple white headstone with his name, rank, and dates of service. Someone had left a small American flag in the ground beside it, probably one of his old Navy buddies who still made the trip. I stood there for a long time, hands in my coat pockets, watching the sun set over the rows of white markers. I testified before Congress today, I said finally, about special operations reform. They asked hard questions. I gave harder answers. I paused. You would have been proud. Or terrified. Maybe both. The wind picked up, cold and sharp. I pulled my coat tighter. I'm wearing 3 stars now. They promoted me last month, Vice Admiral. I'm one of the youngest women to ever hold the rank. I looked down at the headstone. I thought about calling you. Then I remembered you're not there to answer anymore. A groundskeeper drove past on a small utility vehicle, nodded respectfully, and continued on. I waited until he was out of sight. I still get angry sometimes. When I think about all those years you didn't see me. When I remember introducing myself at functions and having men assume I was someone's wife, not someone's commander. When I think about how hard I had to work just to be taken half as seriously as my male peers. I crouched down, brushed some leaves off the headstone. But I also remember that last year. The way you tried. It wasn't enough, but it was something. I stood back up. Commander Raines called me last week. He's retiring, moving to Colorado. He told me that barbecue changed his life. Made him look at his own daughter differently. Made him realize he'd been making the same mistakes you did. He thanked me. I laughed, short and bitter. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson that day. I was just trying to survive a family dinner. A jet passed overhead, likely heading to Reagan National. I tracked it across the sky until it disappeared. I'm mentoring 6 junior officers right now. All women. All brilliant. All fighting battles they shouldn't have to fight. I'm trying to make it easier for them. Trying to clear the path so they don't have to prove themselves the way I did. I paused. I think that's what you were trying to tell me at the end. That the work isn't just the missions. It's the people who come after. The sun was almost gone now. The cemetery sinking into twilight. I needed to leave soon. Needed to get back to my apartment and prepare for tomorrow's briefings. But I stayed a moment longer. I forgave you, I said quietly. I'm not sure when it happened exactly. Maybe it was when I read your note. Maybe it was later, when I realized I was carrying your ring in my pocket like a talisman. Maybe it's happening right now, standing here, telling you about my life like you can still hear me. I took a breath. You hurt me for a long time, but you also raised me to be resilient, to serve quietly, to do the work without needing applause. You just never realized I'd take those lessons and build something you couldn't imagine. I reached out and touched the cold stone. I miss you. Not the version of you that dismissed me. The version from that last year, the one who finally saw me. I wish we'd had more time with that version. I pulled my hand back. But we didn't. So, I'm taking what you gave me, the good and the bad, and I'm using it to build something better for the women who come after me. For the daughters who deserve fathers who see them from the start. I straightened my coat, squared my shoulders. I have to go. I have a breakfast meeting with the Chief of Naval Operations tomorrow. We're discussing the next generation of information warfare strategy. Big decisions. Lives in the balance. The kind of work you never thought I'd do. I smiled. But I'm doing it. And I'm doing it well. I started to walk away, then stopped and looked back. You introduced me wrong once, Dad. But I introduced myself correctly every day after. And that made all the difference. I saluted, sharp and precise. Then I turned and walked back to my car, carrying his memory and my own. Hard-won certainty that I'd earned every single step of the journey. The cemetery gates were closing as I drove out. In my rearview mirror, I could see the headstones disappearing into darkness. Row after row of service members who'd given everything they had. My father was among them now. And someday, I would be too. But not yet. I still had work to do. That's how his Little Clerk became the admiral he never saw coming. Video ends with a thoughtful, knowing look from the protagonist, perhaps a slight, proud smile. What about you? Have you ever had to fight to be truly seen, or to change someone's mind about who you are? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear your experiences.